Hey friends, tonight we go somewhere quiet together, somewhere interesting, somewhere that makes the world feel a little larger and your bed feel a little safer. Find your most comfortable position and just let yourself settle for a moment. If this is your first time here, you're in exactly the right place. Tonight we're going somewhere most people have never truly visited. Not the ballrooms, not the corridors. We're going into the part of a Victorian mansion that no one was supposed to see. The part that existed before sunrise, before the family woke, before the performance began. Past the parlour, past the dining room, up the polished staircase to the second floor of a wealthy Victorian household in the 1880s, to a bedroom that is warm and still and smells faintly of lavender and beeswax where a woman is still sleeping. And here is something worth knowing before we begin. In 1880s England, a woman of the upper classes could pass an entire morning without once performing a single act of physical labour for herself. She did not light her own fire. She did not pour her own water. She did not lay out her own clothes or open her own curtains or decide what she would eat for breakfast without a small army of household staff who had already been awake for 3 hours, making every single one of those decisions on her behalf. The typical Victorian upper-class household employed between 10 and 30 domestic servants, depending on the family's wealth, and the primary purpose of roughly half of those servants was to ensure that their mistress's morning felt effortless, graceful, and perfectly arranged. I always want to know where you are when you listen to this. Leave me a comment. I genuinely read every single one. While she slept, the house woke up around her. By 5:30 in the morning, the kitchen maid was already on her knees in the cold, relighting the kitchen range. By 6, the housemaid was carrying coals 2 flights up to lay the bedroom fire. By 7, hot water was being heated, breakfast was beginning, and the lady's maid had already pressed the dress that would be laid out and waiting before her mistress opened her eyes. She did not need an alarm clock. The house itself was her alarm. The world arranged itself around her waking, and she emerged into it the way a person steps into a room that has been prepared entirely for them. Every candle placed, every surface polished, every small discomfort anticipated and removed before it could become an inconvenience. That is where we are going tonight. Into that bedroom, into that morning, into the extraordinary, elaborate, quietly exhausting machinery of a wealthy Victorian woman's day, which began not when she woke but hours before. In the cold and the dark in the servant quarters far above her head, where young women who had never known a morning that belonged entirely to themselves were already working so that she could have one. Take a breath, dim your lights if you haven't already, and come with me to the 1880s. The gaslight is just coming on in the streets below. The fog is pressing against the window glass. Somewhere in the house, a fire is being lit. And upstairs, in a room full of heavy curtains and warm blankets, and the particular hush of a household holding itself very still, someone is about to wake up to the most carefully managed morning imaginable. The house on a good street in London, and it was always on a good street, always within the right boundaries of the right neighbourhood, always the kind of address that communicated something before a single word was spoken. That house began its day in stages, not all at once, not with a single bell or a single sound. It came alive the way a body comes alive after a long sleep, warming from the centre outward, the kitchen first, then the ground floor rooms, then the upper floors, and last of all, slowly, and with great ceremony, the bedrooms where the family lay sleeping. The first person awake was almost always the kitchen maid. Her name, in a household of any size, was usually one of a small number of names that seemed to recycle through domestic service in this era: Sarah, Mary, Jane, Ellen. She was probably between 14 and 18 years old. She slept in a room at the top of the house, often shared with 1 or 2 other maids, in a space so removed from the elegant lower floors that it might as well have been a different building entirely. bare floorboards, a window that let in the cold, a bed that was narrow and not particularly soft. She'd been asleep for perhaps 6 hours, sometimes less, and when the household bell rang or the housekeeper knocked, if she was lucky enough to have a housekeeper who knocked, which not all of them were, she got up without complaint because complaining was not part of the arrangement. Her first task every morning was the kitchen range. The great iron range that dominated the kitchen was the beating heart of the Victorian household, and it required constant attention. Through the night it had been damped down, the coals banked, the draughts adjusted, the whole apparatus kept alive at a low simmer so that it would not need to be started from scratch in the morning. But it needed to be cleaned before it could be used. The iron grates had to be raked out. The ash had to be removed. The range itself had to be black-leaded, rubbed with a thick black paste made from graphite, then polished to a shine with a stiff brush. This task alone could take half an hour, and it was done on one's hands and knees in a kitchen that was still cold, in an apron that would be black with grime by the time the task was finished. Then came the coal scuttle, then the relighting, then the hauling of water from wherever water was hauled in that particular house, because while some London households in the 1880s had indoor plumbing, many still relied on courtyard pumps or street standpipes for at least some of their water supply. Then the kettle going on. Then the first of what would be many, many trips up and down the back stairs before the morning was properly underway, the back stairs. This is a detail that deserves a moment of attention because it tells you almost everything about how the Victorian household was organised. Great Victorian houses were built with 2 completely separate circulation systems. There were the main stairs, carpeted, polished, lit by good windows, which the family used to move between floors. And there were the back stairs, narrow, plain, sometimes not much more than a ladder in older houses, which the servants used. The 2 groups moved through the same building without ever sharing the same vertical space. The family glided down a staircase designed for elegance. The servants climbed a staircase designed for invisibility. And when those 2 paths did cross, when a maid happened to be in a corridor at the same moment as her employer, the expectation was that she would turn her face to the wall and wait for them to pass. Not out of shame, or at least not officially, simply because the machinery of the household was supposed to be invisible, and a maid standing still with her face turned away was less visible than a maid meeting your eyes in a corridor at 7 in the morning. By the time the kitchen was warm and the range was going properly, the housemaid was already at work on the upper floors. Her task in those early morning hours was threefold. She had to clean the grates in each of the main rooms, lay and light the fires, and ensure that the rooms were as they should be before any member of the family was likely to appear in them. In a house with multiple reception rooms, a study, a morning room, a dining room, perhaps a library, this meant moving from room to room with a coal scuttle and a hearth brush, kneeling down, working quickly, getting coal dust on her apron and sometimes on her face, and finishing in such a way that by the time the room was needed, no evidence of the labour would remain. The bedroom fires were particularly important. The Victorian bedroom was not heated through the night, or at least not in most households. Coal was expensive enough that burning it for warmth while a person slept was considered unnecessary. But the cold of an early autumn morning in London, or worse, a January morning, was significant enough that stepping into an unheated bedroom was genuinely unpleasant. So the housemaid carried coals to the bedroom grates in those early hours, and laid fires that would be ready to light at the proper moment. Not too early, because the room would be smoke-scented before the mistress woke, and not too late, because a cold bedroom at waking was a failure of management. There is something quietly extraordinary about this arrangement when you actually sit with it. A woman who had never met you and would likely never exchange a personal word with you was kneeling beside your grate before you were conscious, arranging coals with careful precision so that your first sensation upon waking would be warmth. Not because she felt warmly toward you, not because she had been asked to think about your comfort in personal terms, because this was the job, because the house required it, because somewhere in the long chain of Victorian domestic expectation, someone had decided that a cold bedroom in the morning was a failure, and so the fire was laid and so the warmth was there, and you woke into it as if warmth was simply the natural state of things. The lady's maid operated on a slightly different schedule than the lower servants. She was, in the hierarchy of the household, a significant step above the housemaid and the kitchen maid. She ate her meals separately from the lower servants in many households, sometimes with the housekeeper and the butler at a small table of their own, which was called the upper servants' table, and which had its own elaborate protocols and social codes almost as complex as those governing the family above. She had, in some households, her own small room rather than sharing, and she was expected to have skills that went well beyond basic domestic labour. She was a skilled needlewoman. She was familiar with the care of expensive fabrics. She understood hair, the elaborate architectural systems that Victorian women's hair required, the crimping irons and the papers and the pinning and the setting. And she was expected to be discreet in a way that transcended ordinary discretion, because she would know things about her mistress that no one else in the house knew, and the understanding was absolute that none of it would ever be spoken of. In the early morning, before the mistress was awake, the lady's maid had her own preparations to make. The dress for the morning, whatever had been selected either by the mistress the evening before or by the maid herself, according to her mistress's established preferences, needed to be checked, pressed if necessary, and laid out. In the 1880s, getting dressed was a project, not a task, a project. And because the lady's maid understood this better than anyone, her morning work was directed toward making that project run as smoothly and as quickly as possible once it began. Let me tell you about the dress itself for a moment, because the 1880s were a particular and dramatic moment in Victorian fashion, and understanding what a wealthy woman wore in this decade illuminates everything about her morning routine, her relationship to her own body, and the labour of the servants who maintained it. By 1880, the crinoline, that enormous steel-hooped cage skirt that had dominated fashion in the 1860s, where it was a memory. What had replaced it was the bustle. The bustle of the early 1880s was a different structure from the earlier version that had appeared briefly in the 1870s. By this decade, the bustle had become truly dramatic, a projecting shelf at the back of the skirt that extended outward in a way that transformed a woman's silhouette into something that looked, from the side, almost architectural. Underneath the dress there were layers, a chemise first against the skin, fine cotton or linen, designed to protect the more expensive outer garments from the body's own oils and warmth. Over that, the corset. Then a corset cover to protect the dress fabric from the corset's whalebone and metal. Then drawers, then at least one petticoat, sometimes more, depending on the weight and construction of the skirt. Then the bustle frame itself, a structure of steel hoops or horsehair padding or wire, depending on the season and the style, designed to create that characteristic projection at the back. Then the skirt, then the bodice, then whatever accessories the occasion required. The total weight of this ensemble could reach 10 or 12 pounds. The corset alone, laced to the waist measurement that fashion considered appropriate for a well-dressed woman of this era, could reduce the natural waistline by several inches. The effect on breathing was real and documented. Women who corseted routinely for years described learning to breathe from the upper chest rather than the diaphragm, a shallow restricted breath that became automatic after enough time in stays. Physicians wrote about it in medical journals. Some condemned it in the strongest language available to Victorian medicine. Others, more cautiously, suggested that the corseted figure was simply the natural expression of feminine delicacy, and that women who experienced discomfort were probably lacing too tightly or were constitutionally unsuited to proper dress. The lady's maid knew all of this. She knew her mistress's corset, knew exactly how tightly it was usually laced, knew where the stays tended to chafe, knew whether the hooks and eyes on the bodice ran smoothly, or whether one in particular needed patience to fasten. She knew which gloves went with which dress, and which hairpiece had been ordered to match the green wool walking suit, and how many petticoats were required under the heavier winter skirt versus the lighter silk afternoon dress. This knowledge was practical and detailed and accumulated over years, and it was never written down, and it was never rewarded in any formal sense, and it belonged entirely to someone else. We are not there yet. We are still in those early hours, the household humming below the sleeping mistress, the fires being laid, the kettle going on, the kitchen maid on her knees, the housemaid carrying coals, the lady's maid pressing a collar with a heated iron in a small room somewhere off the main corridor. And in the middle of all of this, in the main bedroom at the front of the house, always the front, always the most desirable exposure, always with the best window light and the best view of the street below, the woman at the centre of all this activity was still asleep. Let us stay here for a moment and just look at the room. The Victorian upper-class bedroom of the 1880s was a statement as much as a sleeping space. The bed itself was substantial, a full-sized or king-sized bedstead of carved walnut or mahogany, with a headboard that might rise 3 or 4 feet, with turned posts and decorative finals, with a mattress that was a layered construction of horsehair and feather, and a fabric ticking that had to be turned and aired regularly. Over the mattress, the bedclothes were arranged in a particular order, a bottom sheet first, smooth and pulled tight, then another sheet for sleeping beneath, then a wool blanket and perhaps another, and over everything a quilt or a counterpane, the latter term referring specifically to the decorative cover that faced outward and was meant to be seen, which was made of something beautiful enough to merit the position, often white work embroidery or a woven damask pattern. The curtains at the window were heavy. This was partly practical. The fog and chill of London mornings was real, and thin curtains did not keep it out, and partly a matter of appearance, because the Victorians understood curtains as furnishings in the full sense, not merely window coverings. They were lined and interlined and edged with fringe or trim. They moved slowly when drawn, with a soft heaviness that was entirely different from the crisp snap of a modern curtain pulled on a lightweight rod. When they were drawn shut, the room became genuinely dark, the kind of dark that was absolute before electric street lighting, before the glow of nearby buildings, before any of the ambient light that we simply accept as part of nighttime today. On the dressing table there was a mirror, oval or rectangular, framed in walnut or rosewood, angled to catch the best light from the window. Before it sat the small army of objects that a wealthy Victorian woman accumulated over years of receiving gifts and purchasing necessities: glass bottles of lavender water and rose water and tooth powder, a porcelain hair receiver with a small hole in the top, designed to collect the hair that came out in brushing so that it could be saved and eventually used to pad a hairpiece, a silver-backed brush and comb and hand mirror that had almost certainly been given as a wedding gift or a birthday present, their backs engraved with a monogram or a small decorative flourish, a pincushion studded with the pins that held every hairpiece and every collar in place, a small dish for rings that were removed at night, a larger dish for the hairpins and combs that would be inserted in the morning. The washstand was in a corner, a marble-topped piece of furniture with a basin and a ewer, the pitcher that held the water for washing, both pieces almost certainly matching, part of a set decorated with a pattern of flowers or geometric lines that coordinated with the rest of the room. In households with indoor plumbing, the washstand might be supplemented or replaced by a proper wash basin connected to pipes, but many houses, even in the 1880s, still relied on the morning can of hot water that a servant would carry up each day, a routine so established that it had its own specific name and its own specific time in the morning schedule. The chamber pot was under the bed or in a bedside cabinet, a lidded pot of decorated china in the better households, its presence acknowledged by no one in polite conversation, and its management entirely the province of the housemaid, who would remove it, empty it, scrub it, and return it to its position as part of her morning rounds, and who would have been deeply mortified to be observed doing so by any member of the family, and who would have been fired if she had not done so. And beside the bed, on a small night table, there was probably a glass of water, covered with a small square of linen to keep dust out. Perhaps a book, perhaps a small clock, though for women in households of this level, clocks in the bedroom were sometimes considered unnecessary. The household routine was regular enough, and the servants reliable enough, that knowing the precise time was less important than knowing that everything was proceeding as it should. This is the room, and in the middle of it, buried under the warm weight of blankets and counterpane, the mistress of the household is still asleep. Her name, let us call her something appropriately Victorian, something that sounds right in this room, in this decade. Eleanor, Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, wife of a prosperous barrister or a successful merchant, or a man who had inherited money and was doing adequately well with it. 32 years old, perhaps, or 38. 2 children, a household of 8 servants, a house in Bayswater or Kensington, a neighbourhood that in the 1880s was precisely the right kind of respectable, without being so fashionable as to be exhausting, or so unfashionable as to be embarrassing. Eleanor is asleep and the house is waking around her, and in perhaps 40 minutes she will begin the long and carefully managed process of becoming, once again, Eleanor Hartley, wife and mother and mistress of this household, a figure assembled layer by layer from the raw material of a woman who is at this particular moment just a person sleeping in a warm bed. She does not hear the kitchen range being black-leaded. She does not hear the coals being carried up the back stairs. She has in all likelihood never in her adult life been present in her kitchen during those early morning hours, and it is entirely possible that she has no specific image of what they look like. Those hours, that work, those young women with coal dust on their aprons kneeling beside grates, she will never see in that state. The house manages itself in her understanding. It does not manage itself, of course, but the whole architecture of the Victorian domestic arrangement is designed to produce that impression. The morning, when it finally comes for Eleanor, begins not with an alarm but with a knock, a light knock, 2 raps evenly spaced, then a pause, then the door opens 6 inches, enough for the lady's maid, let us call her Agnes, to look inside and confirm that her mistress is stirring. Agnes is perhaps 24 years old. She has been in service since she was 15, and in this particular position for the last 3 years. She is good at her work, in the specific way that people who have no alternative become good at things, through repetition, through observation, through the careful accumulation of knowledge that has no value anywhere except in this room, in this household, in service to this particular woman. Good morning, ma'am. Agnes's voice is quiet, practiced, calibrated to the specific volume required to wake someone gently. Not a whisper, that would be too uncertain, too easy to sleep through, but not a normal speaking voice either. Something in between, with an edge of formality that signals, this is the beginning of the day, and the day has expectations. Eleanor is already half awake, probably. The fire has been lit in the grate. Quietly, Agnes would have managed this on a previous visit, and the room has warmed to something tolerable. The curtains are still drawn. The room is still dim, still caught between night and morning, and Eleanor lies in that particular suspended state for a moment, not quite in the world yet, feeling the warmth, hearing Agnes moving softly around the room, and allowing herself the small luxury of these final few seconds before the day properly begins. It is worth pausing here to think about what luxury actually meant in this context, because we tend to think of luxury as acquisition, as having things, more things, better things, more expensive things. But the particular luxury of Eleanor Hartley's morning was not primarily about objects. It was about the absence of effort. It was about the radical, extraordinary arrangement by which she could lie still in a warm room while another person, A person who had woken 2 hours earlier and had already been working in the cold, performed every small act of preparation that the morning required, so that when Eleanor finally sat up, everything was already done. The curtains would be opened at the right moment, not too early and not too late. The fire would already be burning. The hot water would arrive within minutes of her sitting up, carried in a small brass or copper can specifically designed for this purpose, what was called the morning can, and poured into the basin on the washstand. Fresh towels would be folded and waiting. The dress for the morning would be laid out over the back of a chair, along with every piece of clothing required to wear it, from the chemise at the bottom of the pile to the collar at the top, arranged in the order in which they would be put on. The morning can of hot water is one of those small Victorian domestic details that seems trivial until you really think about what it meant. Running hot water on demand did not exist in most Victorian homes, even wealthy ones, until well into the late 1880s and 1890s, when indoor plumbing became more sophisticated and the technology of the geyser, a water heater installed in the bathroom, made it possible to produce hot water at the turn of a tap. Before that, hot water for washing required someone to heat it, carry it, and deliver it. In the morning, this was done in individual cans or jugs, usually about a gallon, enough for a proper wash of the face, neck, and hands, the parts of the body that were considered necessary to wash every morning. The full bath was a separate, more elaborate affair, taken less frequently, in a different location, with more preparation. Agnes has carried the morning can up from the kitchen, 2 flights of stairs on the back staircase, holding it carefully by the handle because the metal is hot enough to burn if grasped wrong, and she pours it into the basin on the washstand where it steams gently in the cool air of the bedroom. She checks the temperature of the room, which she can feel from experience rather than from a thermometer. She adjusts the fire slightly, turning the front coals with a small poker to encourage a better burn, then straightens and turns to the bed where Eleanor is beginning to sit up. Eleanor moves into the morning with a kind of deliberate slowness that is partly natural and partly learned, partly the slowness of someone waking gently, and partly the movement of someone who has grown up understanding that hurry is not ladylike, that the morning is not a rush, that a woman of her position does not scramble into her clothes or splash her face hastily from a basin. The pace of the morning is measured, it has a rhythm. She sits on the edge of the bed first, feet on the floor, wrapped in the warmth she has brought with her from sleep. She is wearing a nightgown, long, white, high-collared, long-sleeved, made of fine cotton or linen, probably trimmed at the cuffs and collar with a small amount of broderie anglaise or narrow lace. Sleeping naked was simply not done, and even in the privacy of her own bedroom, Eleanor's nightgown maintained the modesty that the Victorian era demanded of all bodies, including the body's relationship to itself. On her feet go a pair of slippers, warm-soled, probably backed in velvet or soft leather, the kind of thing that looks decorative but is also genuinely useful for moving across cold floors in the few minutes before the morning fire has properly warmed the room. And over the nightgown goes the wrapper, or in some households called the dressing gown, a long, loose garment designed for exactly this transitional moment between sleep and dress. By the 1880s, the morning wrapper had become something of a fashion item in itself. The most fashionable versions were made of soft wool or cashmere in warm colours, occasionally silk for households of exceptional wealth, and some were quilted or padded for warmth. They were trimmed at the collar and cuffs, and they served the dual purpose of keeping Eleanor warm during the time it took to wash and begin dressing, while also ensuring that, if a servant entered the room unexpectedly, she was not in a state that would have been considered in any way immodest. The Victorian management of the body and modesty was complex and layered in a way that is hard to fully appreciate today, and it shaped even these most private morning rituals in ways that were so habitual they were probably invisible to Eleanor herself. She did not think about the wrapper as a modesty garment in the moment she put it on. She simply put it on, because one put on the wrapper before one moved around the bedroom in the morning. It was as automatic as breathing. The rule was so thoroughly internalized that the rule itself had disappeared. leaving only the behaviour. The wash comes first. Eleanor moves to the washstand, where the basin of hot water is steaming and the soap and the face cloth are laid out precisely. The soap in a well-appointed Victorian household would have been something good, not the harsh laundry soap that the servants used for the heavy cleaning, but something milled and scented, perhaps lavender or rose, imported from Pears or from one of the other established soap manufacturers whose products had become standard items in any household that wished to be considered properly managed. There might also be a small jar of cold cream, a preparation of beeswax and almond oil and rose water, or a similar formula used to soften the skin and counteract the drying effect of frequent washing with soap. The Victorians understood dry skin rather better than they are sometimes credited for, and a woman of Eleanor's station would have had her own established routine of oils and creams that she used every morning, products bought from a chemist or occasionally mixed at home from recipes passed down through the household, or copied from one of the many domestic advice books that were published in extraordinary numbers throughout the Victorian era. The washing itself was careful and thorough. Face first, then neck, then the wrists and hands. Some women in this period also managed a more thorough washing of the body using a method that involved a large sponge and methodical attention to different areas in sequence. This was considered appropriate and was recommended in many domestic advice books as preferable to bathing infrequently and washing superficially. The full bath was typically taken 2 or 3 times a week for women of Eleanor's class, in a proper bathroom if one existed in the house, or in a portable tin bath brought to the bedroom and filled with water carried up by the servants, a procedure that required considerable labour and was therefore scheduled rather than spontaneous. But the morning wash was daily, and it was the starting point, and the care given to it, the quality of the soap, the temperature of the water, the cleanliness of the towel, the gentle pat rather than the rough rub to dry the face. All of this was part of what distinguished the morning of a woman of Eleanor's position from the morning of someone who had to make do with a cold washstand and a single rough cloth. Agnes is present throughout, in the room but not intrusive, available but not hovering. This is a skill in itself, the ability to be in a small space with another person who is doing intimate things and to occupy exactly the right amount of presence, not so far away as to be unhelpful when needed, not so close as to make the mistress feel watched, moving about the room quietly, doing small tasks, straightening, laying out items, removing last night's glass of water, adjusting something on the dressing table, while Eleanor washes and dries and begins to feel like herself. There is a particular kind of intimacy in this arrangement that the Victorians both relied upon and also carefully managed. Agnes knew Eleanor's face without makeup, which very few people in Eleanor's social circle were permitted to know. She knew the small things that the morning revealed, the puffiness of a bad night, the slight redness of a cold coming on, the lines that were beginning to appear at the corner of the eyes that no amount of cold cream could prevent. She was in some ways more familiar with Eleanor's physical reality than Eleanor's own husband was, because it was Agnes who was present for the unadorned version, and it was Agnes's job to transform that unadorned version into the presented one. The hair, if the dress was a project, the hair was a feat of engineering. Victorian hairstyles in the 1880s were complicated. The fashionable silhouette of this decade placed the hair up, arranged on the back and crown of the head in a configuration that might include a bun, a chignon, curled fringe over the forehead, and various supplementary pieces, pads of horsehair or wool covered with fabric, hairpieces made from the collected combings of previous brushings, additional switches of false hair in matching shades, all pinned and secured and arranged to create a finished effect that looked, to the untrained eye, simply like a great deal of magnificent hair, but which was in fact an assemblage of natural and artificial elements held together with between 20 and 40 hairpins, and as much skill as Agnes could bring to the task. The process began with brushing. 100 strokes was the standard recommendation. This number appears in virtually every Victorian domestic manual and ladies' guide to health and beauty published in this era, and it was taken seriously not as a vague cultural notion, but as an actual daily practice. The bristle brush used for this was made from boar bristles set into a wooden or bone-backed handle, and the action of drawing it through the hair from root to end served several real purposes. It distributed the natural oils of the scalp along the length of the hair shaft, giving the hair a shine and manageability that it lacked without this attention. It loosened any tangles that had formed overnight, since Eleanor's hair would have been braided or loosely confined for sleep to prevent matting, and it massaged the scalp, which the Victorians believed, with some accuracy as later science would confirm, promoted healthy hair growth. The hair receiver on the dressing table was for the hairs that came out in the brush. Eleanor's hair, thick, dark and long, because this was the era before short hair for women and the expectation was that a woman's hair was long enough to dress properly, would lose perhaps 50 to 100 hairs per day through normal brushing, and every one of those hairs was collected in the china receiver, separated from the brush and saved. When enough had accumulated, they would be used to stuff a small pad, a toupee or cushion, that would be incorporated into the dressed hairstyle, increasing its volume and allowing it to take the shape that fashion required. Nothing was wasted. The body's own shed hair became an accessory, circular and thrifty in a way that was entirely characteristic of the Victorian approach to domestic material. Agnes worked quickly but not hastily. She had done Eleanor's hair enough times that she understood its particular qualities, where it was finer and more prone to flyaways, which side it preferred to part on, how it behaved in damp weather versus dry. The technique she used was part training and part accumulated personal knowledge, and the result she achieved every morning was the product of both. She divided the hair into sections, each one pinned up temporarily while she worked on another, creating order from what would otherwise have been an unmanageable mass. The back sections were gathered first, twisted and folded into the beginning of the chignon or coil that would anchor the whole structure. The front sections, the fringe and the hair above the ears, were dealt with last because these were the most visible and required the most precision. The fringe in the 1880s was fashionable, and maintaining it required additional attention. If Eleanor's hair was naturally straight, the fringe would have been crimped with a small iron heated in the fire, a frizzing iron or crimping iron, a narrow tool about the length of a finger that was held in the flame for a moment, and then touched to sections of damp or paper-wrapped hair, leaving a wave or a crimp that held through the day. The smell of heated hair, slightly burnt, slightly metallic, hung briefly in the morning air, then dispersed. Agnes worked with practiced speed, assessing the temperature of the iron against her wrist before applying it. If it was too hot, it would scorch the hair, and scorched hair was a disaster that could not be quickly repaired. Hairpins came next, by the dozen, inserted with precise pressure at specific angles that Agnes had determined through long practice would hold the arrangement in place for an entire day, including any social calls, any carriage rides over cobblestone streets, any movements of the head required by polite conversation. The finished arrangement was smooth at the crown and nape, with the chignon positioned according to the fashion of the season, and with the fringe arranged over the forehead in small, soft waves. Eleanor would glance at herself in the dressing mirror, perhaps turn her head slightly to check the back in a smaller hand mirror that Agnes held angled behind her, and make a small sound of approval or offer a minor correction. The left side needs adjusting, or the pin at the back isn't sitting right, and Agnes would attend to it immediately, her face neutral, her hands skilled. It is worth saying clearly that this was skilled work. The argument might be made, and has been made by historians of domestic labour, that Victorian hairdressing and ladies' maid work generally was a genuine craft requiring years of practice to perform well, on par in its technical requirements, with many occupations that were classified as skilled trades in the same era and compensated accordingly. The difference was that it was performed by women in private households, that it served the personal needs of another individual, and that the Victorian framework for valuing labour simply did not have a category for this kind of expertise that allowed it to be recognised as the skill it was. It was domestic service. It was what maids did. The craft was invisible inside the category. Agnes knew this. She knew it the way all Victorian servants knew it. Not usually as an articulated grievance, but as the simple givenness of her situation, the water she swam in. She was good at what she did. She was paid £12 to £15 a year, which was the standard wage for a lady's maid in a middle-upper household in the 1880s, plus her room and board. She had been hired in part for exactly this skill, and she brought it to Eleanor's dressing table every morning without fuss or flourish, or any expectation that it would be particularly noticed, because being noticed was not part of the arrangement. Doing the job was. The dressing proper begins now. Eleanor has washed and her hair is done, and Agnes has gone to the chair where the day's clothing is laid out and is holding the chemise, the first layer. Eleanor takes it, slips it over her head. Fine cotton, probably white, cut to hang straight from the shoulders and fall to mid-calf, with a round neck and short sleeves. Against the skin it is cool for just a moment, then warm. It is the innermost layer, the layer closest to the body, the layer that the body will actually touch throughout the day. And it is freshly laundered. Everything is always freshly laundered in a well-run Victorian household, because the management of laundry was one of the major ongoing productions of the domestic calendar, and cleanliness of linen was one of the most scrutinized measures of household standards. The corset next. Agnes brings it, and Eleanor turns slightly, and the ritual of lacing begins. The Victorian corset of the 1880s was a garment of significant construction, boned with whalebone or steel, stays sewn into channels along the length of the fabric, laced at the back with a long cord that could be adjusted to achieve whatever degree of compression was required, and fastened at the front with a busk, a flat piece of metal that hooked together down the centre front, and allowed the garment to be put on and taken off without fully unlacing it each time. The busk was actually a significant practical innovation. It had been introduced in the 1850s and had made the process of corseting considerably more manageable than it had been in the era of fully laced back garments that required an assistant for every putting on and taking off. Eleanor stands straight, arms slightly lifted, and Agnes laces the corset from the top down, drawing the laces to a tension that was not in the daily reality of Eleanor's life, as extreme as the satirical representations of Victorian corseting would suggest. Tight lacing, the practice of compressing the waist to the extreme dimensions celebrated in fashion plates and cautioned against by physicians, was practiced by some women, but was not universal, and was not in fact what most women of Eleanor's station did every morning. What they did instead was wear a corset laced to a degree of firmness that shaped the torso into the fashionable silhouette, provided support for the weight of the petticoats and skirts that would be attached to it, and maintained the upright posture that was both fashionable and socially expected. This was still restrictive by the standards of modern clothing. It still required some adaptation of breathing, some adjustment of movement, but it was not, for a woman who had worn a corset since her mid-teens, a remarkable or particularly uncomfortable experience. It was simply wearing a corset. It was simply Tuesday. Over the corset, a corset cover, a light cotton garment designed to smooth the outline of the stays under the dress fabric, to prevent the boning from showing through, and to protect the dress itself from any direct contact with the metal or whalebone. Then the drawers, split-legged, cut full, reaching the knee or slightly below, gathered at the waist and attached to a band that tied or buttoned. The split construction of Victorian drawers, which sometimes surprises modern people when they first encounter it, was entirely practical in a decade when answering the call of nature in a full Victorian dress was already a considerable production, and any additional obstacle would have made it worse. The petticoat came next, and the decision about which petticoat and how many was one that Agnes managed with the confidence of long experience. In winter, or for mornings that were expected to be particularly cold, or for outings in unpredictable weather, an additional petticoat might be added. In warmer seasons, the minimum required to keep the skirt hanging properly was sufficient. The petticoat of the 1880s was not the enormous cage construction of the crinoline era. It was cut to fall correctly over the bustle structure, flatter at the front and fuller at the back, achieving the characteristic silhouette of the decade, not through rigid hooping, but through careful construction. And now the bustle. The bustle of the early 1880s, the period sometimes called the high bustle, was a steel or rattan cage structure, or in some versions a tightly stuffed horsehair or wire pad, worn tied around the waist at the back, designed to support the rear drapery of the skirt and maintain the characteristic horizontal shelf projection that had become the defining feature of fashionable dress in this decade. By 1885 or 1886, the bustle would become enormous, reaching its most dramatic extension in the second bustle era, and by 1890 it would be largely gone. Fashion moving toward a simpler silhouette that anticipated the relative plainness of the 1890s. But in 1882 or 1883, the bustle was there, worn, tied, adjusted. Agnes ties it at exactly the right position. She has done this enough times that she knows, without measuring, where it needs to sit to achieve the correct line once the skirt is on. Eleanor holds still during this procedure, arms out slightly, the practiced stillness of a woman who has been dressed by someone else since childhood and has internalized the small adjustments of posture required to make the task easier. The skirt, long fitted at the front across the hips and abdomen, falling in a sheath to the floor at the front and side, then sweeping back in a train or a gather over the bustle. The characteristic silhouette of the 1880s dress was controlled and fitted at the front, dramatic and projected at the back. It was held closed with hooks and eyes down the centre back or the side back typically, or with a combination of hooks and buttons, fastened now by Agnes working from the top down, each closer checked and seated properly before moving to the next. This took time. There were many closures. They were designed to lie perfectly flat and smooth under the dress fabric, and achieving that required both the knowledge of where each one was and the patience to set each one without rushing. Over the skirt, the bodice. The bodice of a day dress in this era was tailored to fit the corseted body, which meant it was fitted very precisely, every seam calculated for the specific measurements of the woman wearing it. The sleeves were cut narrow, fashionable in this decade, and they tapered to a fitted cuff at the wrist. The neck might be finished with a small stand-up collar of the same fabric, or with a separate collar of white cotton or lace that was attached for the day and detached for laundering. These detachable collars and cuffs were one of the practical solutions to the challenge of maintaining very white, very clean linen in an era when the rest of the garment could not easily be washed, and they were replaced with fresh ones every few days or as needed. The colour of the dress. This deserves its own moment, because colour in Victorian fashion was not a simple matter of personal preference. It was an entire system of social information. Morning dresses, the garments worn for the early part of the day, for breakfast and morning tasks and any morning visitors who might call, were typically in lighter, less elaborate colours than afternoon or evening wear. For a morning in 1883, Eleanor might wear a dress in a quiet dark blue, or a warm mauve, or a fine dark green wool, or a striped silk of soft colours. The fabrics too communicated: wool for morning, lighter silks or mixed fabrics for afternoon, heavier silks or velvets for evening. Someone of Eleanor's experience and position read these distinctions automatically. They were part of the visual language of her social world, as readable as speech, and as important to get right. Agnes holds the bodice for Eleanor to slip her arms into, then fastens it from the bottom up. Again hooks and eyes, again careful precision. When it is fastened, she steps back and looks at the hole. She checks the waistline, where the skirt and bodice should meet in a perfectly smooth join. She checks the shoulders, where the sleeves should sit flat without a ridge or a wrinkle. She checks the collar, which should lie crisp and even against the neck. She adjusts the cuffs. She smooths a fold in the skirt at the back. The checking is not performative. It is functional, the final quality assurance of a craftsperson examining finished work. While Agnes is doing this, Eleanor is looking at her reflection in the dressing mirror. She looks, quite honestly, magnificent in the way that the 1880s fashionable woman was designed to look magnificent. Structured, upright, the silhouette clean and precise, the fabrics rich and well chosen. The corset and the construction of the dress have done their work. The hair is arranged with skill. The whole effect is of a woman assembled with great care, which is, of course, exactly what she is. The shoes. Eleanor sits down in the small chair by the dressing table, and Agnes produces the shoes for the morning, ankle boots most likely, of fine leather in a colour that coordinates with the dress, fastening with a row of small buttons up the side. The button hook that Agnes uses for this is a slender metal tool with a twisted handle, the standard implement for managing the small but numerous buttons of Victorian footwear, and Agnes works up the row of closures quickly, the way a pianist runs scales, automatic, practiced, not requiring conscious thought. The stockings have already been put on earlier in the dressing process, between the drawers and the petticoat, fine wool or silk depending on the season, gartered at the knee with a ribbon tie or, in more modern households, the newer elastic garters that were beginning to appear in the 1880s as a practical improvement on ribbon, held in place in a way that kept them smooth and unwrinkled under the dress, because a visible irregularity in the line of a stocking, however slight, was the kind of imperfection that a well-dressed Victorian woman's social eye would notice and quietly judge. Now comes the finishing. The jewellery, not much for mourning, perhaps small earrings if Eleanor's ears were pierced, a simple brooch to close the collar, her wedding ring which she wears always. The brooch in particular was a garment closure as much as a decoration because Victorian collar arrangements were often secured with a pin rather than sewn shut, and the brooch was both functional and decorative, as many Victorian accessories managed to be simultaneously. A watch, perhaps, small, pinned to the bodice front in a small decorative holder called a watch pocket or watch chain, because a woman of Eleanor's position needed to know the time for social coordination, for the management of the household, for the keeping of appointments, and the watch was the practical solution to this need. The gloves will come later, when Eleanor goes out. For now, she is still inside the house, and indoor gloves were not standard for the morning hours at home, but they were prepared, folded over the back of the chair, waiting for the moment when she would take them up. Light ones for morning, soft white or pale cotton, not the heavier kid leather reserved for afternoon calls and outdoor occasions. Agnes gives one final look at the completed effect, and there is a particular professional satisfaction in this that Agnes would not have articulated in these terms, but that was real nonetheless. This is the work. This is the morning's production, and it is good work, well done. Eleanor says something, thank you, Agnes, perhaps, or simply a nod, the small acknowledgement of the completed service, and Agnes begins to tidy the room, folding and putting away the clothes that came off the night before, checking the water in the basin, straightening the items on the dressing table that were displaced during the dressing process. Her morning is not over. It will not be over for many hours. But this particular performance, the one she has been working towards since she heated the water and laid the fire and pressed the collar and counted the hairpins in the drawer, is finished. Eleanor leaves the bedroom and moves toward the stairs. The main stairs, of course. The front stairs carpeted, with the polished brass stair rods holding the carpet flat at each tread, with the light from the landing window coming through in a way that is already starting to look like proper morning. She descends toward breakfast, toward the rest of the day, toward all the social machinery that awaits her, moving in her dressed and arranged and precisely managed person through a house that has been working since before dawn to make this moment look effortless. Downstairs, in the dining room, the breakfast table is set. Now let us talk about what breakfast meant for a wealthy Victorian household in the 1880s. Because it was considerably different from what that word tends to conjure in the modern imagination. The Victorian breakfast was the great opportunity of the day for the display of domestic abundance. More than dinner, which had its own elaborate protocols and formalities, breakfast was where the immediate material comfort of the household was on show. The quality of the provisions, the efficiency of the kitchen, the ability to produce every morning without exception a meal that was warm and complete and properly arranged before the family came to the table, That this required the kitchen staff to have been working since 5:30 in the morning was not the point. The point was the table. The breakfast table in Eleanor's dining room was set with a cloth, white damask linen, starched to a stiffness that made it satisfying to touch, pressed without a single visible fold, and laid with the family's good china. Not the finest china, which was for dinner parties and special occasions, but good china, the everyday service, which in a household of Eleanor's position was still considerably above average. The cups were matched. The serving dishes had lids. Everything was where it should be. The food on that table would, by any objective measure, astonish a modern observer in terms of its quantity and variety. The Victorian upper-class breakfast was a generous meal, organised on principles of abundance rather than minimalism, and it typically offered guests and family multiple options across a range of dishes that could include hot dishes kept warm in covered chafing dishes on the sideboard, eggs of various preparations, scrambled, boiled, fried, poached, bacon or ham, perhaps devilled kidneys, which were an oddly popular Victorian breakfast item involving kidneys cooked in spiced butter or sautéed mushrooms, cold items including cold meats, pressed tongue, potted fish, cold chicken remaining from the previous night's dinner, bread, rolls, toast made in a rack at the table and served with butter and various preserves, and if it was the right season, perhaps kippers or bloaters, the smoked herring preparations that the Victorian palate found entirely appropriate as morning food, and which produced a smell in the dining room that lingered for the better part of the morning. There would be tea, certainly. The great Victorian morning beverage, brewed strong and poured from a silver-plated or silver teapot into matching cups, with milk added according to preference and sugar from the sugar bowl with small tongs. There might also be coffee, though tea held primacy at breakfast throughout most of this era in most English households, and the coffee, if it appeared, was more likely to be requested by individual family members as a preference than to be the default offering. This spread was produced entirely in the kitchen below stairs, by a cook and a kitchen maid who had been at work since before the household was awake, and it was carried upstairs to the dining room by the parlour maid or the footman. If the household employed a footman, which in the 1880s was the marker of a certain level of prosperity, since male domestic servants were taxed at a higher rate than female ones, and therefore their presence in a household signalled that one could afford the tax, and arranged on the sideboard and the table in the correct order and at the correct temperature before anyone descended for breakfast. The timing of this was managed through a complex informal coordination between the servants' hall, the cook, and Agnes, who was expected to know when her mistress was likely to come down. In households with more formal routines, there were established breakfast hours, 9 o'clock, say, or 9:30, and the kitchen worked backward from that time to ensure everything was ready. In slightly less formal households, the timing was more fluid, adjusted according to what was known about the previous evening's activities and the expected schedule of the day. Eleanor comes into the dining room and is greeted by the parlour maid, who pulls out her chair and pours the tea. Eleanor's husband may or may not be there. If he is a man with business in the city, he may have already breakfasted earlier and departed, or he may be present now, behind a newspaper, dealing with toast. The children, if they are old enough to eat with their parents, come in from the nursery floor escorted by their nurse, scrubbed and tidied, and sit at their appropriate places at the table. If they are young, they eat separately in the nursery, under the supervision of the nursery maid, and come down only for a brief morning greeting before their nurse takes them back upstairs. What Eleanor eats for breakfast is, again, governed by the codes of the era. Appetite in women was managed carefully in Victorian social representation. A woman who ate too much was considered unladylike. A woman who ate too little was considered affected or possibly unwell. The correct amount was somewhere in the middle, leaning toward modest, and the items chosen were supposed to align with the Victorian conception of feminine delicacy. One would not, for example, pile one's plate with devilled kidneys in the manner of a hungry man, though one might certainly enjoy a portion of eggs and perhaps one piece of bacon and certainly bread and butter with marmalade and a second cup of tea. None of this is entirely rigid, of course. In the privacy of one's own family dining room, with no guests present, the rules relaxed somewhat. Eleanor was not performing at breakfast the way she would perform at a dinner party. She was in her own house, at her own table, served by her own staff. If she wanted a second helping of scrambled eggs, she had it. After breakfast, the morning had several hours of its own requirements before the social afternoon began. The management of the household was Eleanor's primary professional occupation, in every practical sense except that it was never called that. A wealthy Victorian married woman was the chief executive of a small enterprise that employed between 8 and 30 people, managed a budget for food and household maintenance and clothing and entertainment, dealt with suppliers, tradespeople, and the complex social obligations of her position, and was responsible for maintaining standards of domestic production, the food, the cleaning, the laundry, the hospitality, that were judged publicly every time a guest set foot inside the house. This was work. It was significant, skilled, largely invisible work. And it occupied a substantial portion of every morning. The conversation with the cook was usually one of the first morning tasks. In a well-run Victorian household, this happened daily. Eleanor, or in grander households, the housekeeper on Eleanor's behalf, met with the cook to discuss the day's menus. Not just dinner, but luncheon if it was a day when luncheon was required, any afternoon tea that was expected, and breakfast the following day. The cook would advise on what provisions were available in the kitchen, what needed to be ordered from the tradespeople, whether the butcher had sent good meat or indifferent meat that morning, whether the cream had been thick enough, or whether a note should be sent to the dairy. This conversation required real knowledge on Eleanor's part. She needed to know which guests were coming for dinner, and whether any of them had known dislikes or dietary requirements. She needed to know what the budget for the week allowed, and whether this particular week had been heavy or light in expenditure so far. She needed to have sufficient command of cookery to understand whether a menu was well balanced, not in the modern nutritional sense, but in the Victorian sense of offering appropriate variety across the courses, of not repeating ingredients across different dishes, of calibrating the richness and complexity of the meal to the occasion. A dinner for 3 couples from the neighbourhood required a different menu from a dinner for a distinguished guest from out of town, and Eleanor would make those distinctions automatically. The housekeeper, if Eleanor's household had one, was the second in command of this enterprise, and the morning conversation with her was a separate meeting. The housekeeper managed the female servants directly, their schedules, their work assignments, any disciplinary matters that needed addressing, and she was responsible for maintaining the household supply of linens, cleaning materials, candles and lamp oil, and any other consumable items. She kept a household book, a detailed ledger of all expenditures under her management, and she presented it to Eleanor for review on a regular basis, typically weekly. Then there was the correspondence. Eleanor's morning post might bring letters from friends, notes from tradespeople, invitations to social engagements that required either acceptance or regret, and all of these required responses. The practice of writing notes and letters by hand, and of responding promptly, was a social obligation of near legal force in Eleanor's world. An invitation not responded to within 24 hours was a social failure. A thank you note not sent within a day or two of a dinner party was a lapse that people noticed, and the volume of correspondence generated by an active Victorian social life was considerable. Calling cards, letters of invitation and acceptance and regret, notes of thanks, notes of inquiry, notes of condolence, notes congratulating someone on an engagement or a birth or an achievement of any kind. Eleanor's morning writing desk, with its locked drawer for private papers and its surface fitted with a small inkwell and a pen rest and a supply of her personal writing paper engraved with the household address, was in use most mornings for at least half an hour. The writing paper itself was another opportunity for the quiet signalling of social position. Eleanor's paper was thick enough to feel substantial in the hand, cream or white, with her address engraved at the top in a font that was fashionable without being ostentatious. There was a particular shade of fashionable morning stationery, black bordered in varying widths depending on how recently the loss had occurred and how close the relationship, that a widow or a woman in mourning would use, and the conventions governing this were detailed enough to fill a chapter of their own. Victoria herself had worn mourning for Prince Albert from 1861 until her death in 1901, and the culture of mourning that the Queen embodied had permeated every level of English society, making the management of mourning dress and mourning stationery a matter of genuine social attention. While Eleanor writes her letters at the mourning desk, the rest of the household is continuing its work around her. The housemaids are cleaning the main rooms, dusting, polishing, sweeping, beating rugs if the weather allows them to be taken outside, washing down the stone steps at the front of the house and the areas below stairs. The cook's kitchen is producing the preparations for luncheon and dinner. Agnes is tending to Eleanor's bedroom, remaking the bed with fresh sheets if it is a sheet-changing day, which happened once or twice a week, or simply with carefully remade original bedding on other days, smoothing and tucking with the precision that made a well-made Victorian bed a minor visual pleasure in itself. There is something in all of this that the mourning itself does not announce. It is the underlying fact that Eleanor's mourning, however elegant, however graceful, however full of the small physical pleasures of warm fires and good tea and silk-smooth fabric against dressed skin, is also a mourning built on labour, built, specifically, on the labour of women who came from a different world, who had grown up in circumstances where the kind of mourning Eleanor had was not merely unavailable but probably incomprehensible, where the choice of wrapper was not a consideration because there was one garment or none, where hot water came from a pump, and not from a can carried up polished stairs by a young woman trained to do it silently and invisibly. The Victorian household knew this. It did not in general discuss it. The elaborate etiquette of the master-servant relationship in 1880s England was precisely calibrated to maintain the performance of naturalness on both sides. For the mistress, the performance that this was simply how things were, that the warmth and comfort were simply the right and correct way for a mourning to be, and for the servants the performance of invisible competence, of efficient presence without self-presentation, of skilled labour that had to look like no labour at all. The fact that it was not natural, that it required continuous negotiation and considerable mutual management, was understood by everyone involved. It was simply not the thing you said. Let us follow Eleanor a little further into the mourning, because the mourning extends beyond breakfast and correspondence, and the social rituals of a Victorian woman's day had their own detailed choreography that is worth understanding. The morning call. In Eleanor's world, the phrase morning call referred not to the morning at all, in the chronological sense, but to the afternoon, typically between 2 and 5 o'clock, which Victorian social convention called the morning hours of visiting regardless of what the clock said. This is one of those small counterintuitive facts about the Victorian social calendar that continues to confuse modern readers, and it is worth naming clearly. When Eleanor's social engagements described morning calls, they meant afternoon visits. When the etiquette manuals of the 1880s described the rules for morning visiting, how long to stay, what to wear, whether to leave a card if the hostess was not at home, they were describing what we would call afternoon social calls. The terminology persisted from an earlier era when wealthy households kept later hours and the afternoon really did function as the social morning. But before the afternoon calls began, there was the question of what to do with the late morning hours, those hours between breakfast and luncheon, approximately 10 or 11 o'clock until 1 or 2. For Eleanor, these hours might be occupied with a walk, if the weather permitted and she felt like fresh air. A Victorian woman of her position did not walk vigorously or for great distances. This was not the era of the recreational hiker, and a woman in full 1880s dress doing anything that could be described as athletic was inviting raised eyebrows from anyone who witnessed it. But a gentle walk to a nearby park, or a short walk to do a personal errand at a shop on a good street, was entirely acceptable and considered healthy. She would change into her walking dress for this, a slightly heavier, slightly more practical garment than the morning dress, paired with a jacket or a mantle, a loose outer garment with sleeves that functioned as a coat, and boots that were suitable for pavement. Agnes would help with this change of dress, or would at minimum have laid out the appropriate garments and checked that they were in order before Eleanor came back to the bedroom to change. There is a word for this constant changing. Not quite a word that the Victorians themselves used in this context, but a concept that their domestic life embodied daily, and that word is maintenance. The maintenance of appearance, of standard, of the specific visual and social language of her position, was one of Eleanor's primary morning occupations, not in a vain or superficial sense, but in the same practical sense in which the cook maintained the kitchen and the housemaid maintained the floors. Each thing required attention, each thing had to be done correctly, and for Eleanor the thing that required maintenance was the physical and social presentation of herself and her household. This is again where the servants become visible as essential rather than merely convenient. Every change of dress required help. The back fastenings of the 1880s bodice, the tying of the bustle, the adjustment of the collar, all of these required hands that were not Eleanor's own, operating at angles and in places that Eleanor could not easily reach. The independence that modern women take for granted in the most basic acts of dressing was simply not available to her. She required assistance for every change of clothes, every adjustment of hair, every significant preparation of her person. This was not experienced as oppressive by and large, it was simply the given structure of her days. But it meant that the relationship between Eleanor and Agnes was one of genuine practical dependency, and that the smooth running of Eleanor's morning was, in quite a literal sense, impossible without the skilled and reliable presence of this other woman whose name most history books have never recorded, and whose mornings began 2 hours before Eleanor's own. Let us step back now into the early morning one more time, because I want to stay with the servants a little longer. I want to stay with the part of the morning that Eleanor does not see. Agnes comes from somewhere. She came from somewhere before she came to this house, and she will go somewhere after it, if she is lucky and if the references she receives when she eventually leaves are good enough to secure her another position. She grew up, most likely, in a family of modest means, a tradesman's family or a farming family or a small shopkeeper's family, the kind of family for which domestic service was a realistic career path for a young woman and a way of ensuring that she was housed, clothed, and fed in circumstances better than she might otherwise find. She entered service in her early teens, probably in a smaller household first, where she learnt the basics. She worked her way up through various positions, perhaps as a housemaid, perhaps as a parlour maid, perhaps directly into lady's maid training under an older, more experienced woman who taught her the hair and the dressmaking and the judgment that the role required. She arrived in Eleanor's household with the specific set of skills that Eleanor required, and she has been applying those skills every morning for 3 years. She knows this house, these routines, these particular requirements. She knows that Eleanor prefers her morning tea without sugar, and that her hair is finer on the left side than the right. She knows that there is a small repair needed on the seam of the green walking dress, and she will attend to it this afternoon when Eleanor is out. She knows that the housemaid who was hired 6 months ago is good with fireplaces, but unreliable with laundry, and needs additional supervision, and she mentioned this to the housekeeper last week in the brief daily conversation that runs the operational side of the household. She does not own anything in this house. She does not sit in any of the rooms she dusts, or eat at any of the tables she maintains, or read from any of the books in the library she is not supposed to enter except to clean. She lives at the top of the house in a space that is comfortable by the standards of the street she came from, and modest by any standard above that. She has one afternoon a week off, and perhaps an evening occasionally, and one full day a month when she can go and visit her mother, if her mother lives close enough to be visited in a single day. She has no prospect of advancement beyond a better position in a better household, with higher wages, and the ceiling above that is the position of housekeeper in a very grand household indeed, which very few women reached, and which required a combination of longevity, skill, personality, and luck that only a small number would find. Her world is this house. Her morning is Eleanor's morning, conducted in service of it, visible only in its results. She is 24 years old, and she is good at her work, and she does not appear in the historical record. The nursery. If Eleanor has children, and in an 1880s household of any prosperity it would be unusual not to, then the nursery floor is running its own parallel morning routine, quite separate from the one Eleanor is navigating downstairs. The nurse, officially the children's nurse, sometimes called the nursemaid, though in larger households with older children, the title might be governess for the educational role, or nurse for the physical care, is responsible for the children's entire day from the moment they wake until the moment they go to sleep. In a wealthy Victorian household, this separation of children from their parents for the bulk of every day was not considered cold or distant. It was considered proper. Children required specialized management, and the management of children was a female domestic specialty just as cooking or laundry was, requiring different skills but the same structure of professional service. The nursery floor was typically the top floor of the house, sometimes directly below the servants' quarters in larger houses, or on the same floor in smaller ones. It was a self-contained world. Nursery bedroom, day nursery where the children played and ate, and in wealthier households a schoolroom if the children were old enough for lessons. The nurse slept near the children, available if a child woke in the night, which they frequently did, and responsible for the full span of care from morning bath through evening bedtime. The children's morning routine was considerably more vigorous than their mothers. They were washed thoroughly. The Victorian conviction that children needed cold or cool water in the morning as a health measure was strong, and many domestic manuals and child-rearing guides of the period recommended this practice for building robustness and constitution, though in practice the nurse exercised considerable discretion about just how cold was cold in a winter bedroom. They were dressed in the layered, slightly starched, precisely appropriate clothing of Victorian childhood. Girls in dresses and pinafores, boys in suits with wide collars, everything buttoned and tied and checked for neatness before they left the nursery. They ate their breakfast in the day nursery rather than with their parents, porridge most often for younger children, with bread and butter and perhaps an egg, the staple foods of Victorian nursery feeding. If the children were old enough, they came down to greet their parents at some point in the morning. Often after Eleanor's own breakfast was complete, a brief appearance in the morning room or the drawing room for a supervised visit, before being taken back upstairs by the nurse for lessons or outdoor play in the park. These visits were short by modern standards, half an hour perhaps, and they were managed visits. The children were presented clean, calm, and behaving correctly, and returned to the nursery before the visit could extend into the kind of prolonged contact that might disrupt Eleanor's morning or her own management of the household. This sounds cold. It may have felt cold to some mothers and some children. Victorian domestic advice literature was somewhat contradictory on the question of maternal affection. The same manuals that recommended extensive nursery separation also described the mother's love for her children in the most effusive terms, constructing an ideal of maternal devotion that was genuine in its emotional claims, but largely expressed through management and oversight, rather than through the kind of daily physical and emotional proximity that modern parents tend to associate with closeness. A Victorian mother of Eleanor's class showed her love through ensuring the children were well cared for by qualified people, through the selection of their education, through the provision of appropriate material comfort, through the social and family positions she was managing on their behalf. She was not expected to also be their daily playmate, and many women of this era would have found the modern expectation of constant parental presence exhausting and a little bewildering. Back in the morning room, Eleanor finishes her letters, seals them, and hands them to the parlour maid or the hall boy to be taken to the post box. She consults her diary, a small leather-bound appointment book in which she has recorded the social commitments of the week, the names of who is expected for dinner on Thursday, the calls she intends to make this afternoon, the delivery expected from the dressmaker, the morning she has promised to spend visiting a friend who has been unwell. The diary is not merely a record but a planning instrument, and Eleanor reviews it with the practical attention of a manager reviewing a schedule, noting where there are conflicts, where something needs to be arranged, where she needs to send a note to confirm an arrangement made verbally at a recent social occasion. The management of the social calendar in a Victorian household was its own full-time occupation, invisible because it was continuous and because its smooth execution, like all good household management, looked effortless. Every invitation required a decision, accept or decline, and every acceptance set in motion a chain of preparations that had their own timeline. A dinner party required the menu to be planned, and the food to be ordered, and the table to be prepared, and the extra help to be arranged if the household's own staff could not cover the service. Afternoon calls required appropriate dress, and the consultation of the list of people who were currently being called upon regularly, because the social obligation of returned visits was as strong in Eleanor's world as any legal contract, and considerably more socially enforced. The dressmaker. This requires its own section, because the relationship between Eleanor and her dressmaker was one of the most significant ongoing professional relationships of her adult life, and it occupied significant time in her morning appointments. The ready-to-wear clothing industry was in its very early stages in the 1880s. Shops like Liberty's, which had opened in 1875, and the department stores that were beginning to appear in London's West End were making fabrics and some ready-made items accessible in ways that had not existed a generation earlier. But for women of Eleanor's class, the primary source of clothing was still the dressmaker, a professional woman, almost always a woman, who worked from measurements and patterns and discussed with her client what was needed for the coming season, what fabrics had arrived from the suppliers, what the fashion was currently showing in Paris, and how much time she would need to complete the work. The relationship was intimate in a professional sense. The dressmaker knew Eleanor's measurements exactly, not just the simple measurements that a modern tailor records, but the complex set of body measurements that the construction of a fitted Victorian bodice required. The bust at different heights, the waist, the back length, the shoulder width, the arm length, the pitch of the shoulders, the slight asymmetry that most bodies have and that a skilled dressmaker learned to accommodate and correct for. She knew Eleanor's preferences in colour and fabric. She knew her budget in the way that a regular professional does. She knew what price range was comfortable and what was a special occasion outlay. She was skilled, trained probably through an apprenticeship system similar to that of the domestic servants, having worked as an apprentice seamstress in her earlier career before establishing her own workroom, and she was entirely dependent on the continued goodwill of her clients, because her livelihood came entirely from their patronage, and a reputation for work that was slightly inferior to the competition could destroy a practice that had taken years to build. When the dressmaker came to Eleanor's house, fittings were typically done at home rather than in the dressmaker's workroom, at least for established clients. She would arrive with samples of fabric, with any work in progress that needed to be fitted on the body, and with her pins and her tape measure and the small book in which she recorded measurements and style details. Eleanor would be dressed for the fitting by Agnes, who would then assist during the fitting itself, holding pins and passing fabric samples as needed. A fitting for a complicated bodice might take an hour or more, with Eleanor standing still in her corset and petticoat while the dressmaker worked, adjusting seams, pinning corrections, discussing the placement of trimming. This again was work that required patience and skill from everyone involved, and that produced, at its best, garments of considerable beauty and precision that were also functional in all the ways that Victorian life demanded of women's dress. A well-made 1880s bodice was an engineering achievement. It was structured and boned and fitted to a degree that made it look almost sculptural, and it was simultaneously supposed to allow its wearer to move, to breathe adequately, to sit and stand and receive guests and climb stairs and manage the 100 small physical demands of a day without the construction becoming visible or obtrusive. The tension between structural perfection and practical wearability was one that the skilled dressmaker navigated constantly, and her solutions to it were specific and personal and accumulated over a long professional relationship with each individual client. The morning moves forward. Luncheon in Eleanor's household happened at around 1 or 2 o'clock, and it was a lighter meal than breakfast and considerably lighter than dinner. It might be soup, cold meats from the previous evening's joint, bread, perhaps a simple pudding if there were children at the table. If Eleanor's husband was away for the day at his office or his chambers, luncheon might be taken alone or with the children, and the formality of the meal relaxed accordingly. The tablecloth was still there, the service was still correct, the parlour maid still brought the dishes and cleared the plates, but the social performance of it was lower key, and Eleanor could eat in reasonable comfort and quiet. After luncheon, the afternoon calls, the changing of the dress again, from morning dress to afternoon dress, a slightly more elaborate, slightly richer garment, more ornamented, made of a lighter or finer fabric, appropriate for the social business of the afternoon. Agnes has laid this out already, or will appear to lay it out when Eleanor signals that she is ready to change, and the process of dressing is repeated. Shorter this time, since the hair is already done and needs only checking, but still involving the careful assistance of skilled hands at the fastenings. This is the cycle. This is what the morning produces, and what the afternoon perpetuates, and what the evening will carry forward. The woman assembled in the morning, by the labour of the people who work around her, and through the skilled attention to her own person, that is part of the job of being Eleanor Hartley in 1883 London, will move through the rest of the day as the completed figure that the morning created. And underneath that, always underneath that, running through the entire morning and the entire day, is the labour, the invisible, uncelebrated, skilled, exhausting labour of the women who rose before Eleanor and who will work after she has gone to sleep, who know her face and her body and her preferences and her weaknesses, who lay fires she never sees laid, who carry water she never sees carried, who press collars and count hairpins and black-lead kitchen ranges and build morning canals out of hot water in copper jugs, and who do all of this every day, because this is how the morning works in the 1880s, and the morning has to work because Eleanor's day depends on it. Let me linger for a moment in the space between Eleanor's morning and Agnes's morning, because I think there is something here that the gap itself illuminates. Agnes woke in the dark. Eleanor woke in a warm room with a fire already burning. Agnes dressed herself quickly, practically, in clothes designed for work. Eleanor dressed slowly, elaborately, in clothes designed to be beautiful and to signal her social position to everyone who saw them. Agnes ate in the servants' hall, a separate room below stairs, at a table that had its own hierarchy, with its own rules, with food that was adequate but plain, the kind of food that sustained working people rather than the kind designed to demonstrate abundance. Eleanor ate in the dining room at a table that was itself a social statement, from dishes that were chosen and prepared and presented with care for exactly that purpose. Agnes would spend 12 or 14 hours at work before she was released from the day's duties. Eleanor's day contained work, real work, demanding work, but also significant stretches of leisure, of the social activities that were not technically labour, even if they had their own demands and pressures. Agnes was paid approximately £12 to £15 a year. Eleanor spent more than that on her dressmaker in a single season. Neither of these women would have described the arrangement as unjust, probably. The Victorian framework for thinking about class and domestic service was elaborate enough and sufficiently embedded in the structure of daily life that most people on both sides of the relationship simply accepted it as the order of things. There were women who wrote about it, servants who left memoirs describing the specific texture of this life with a clarity that is sometimes startling, and domestic reformers who argued that the conditions of domestic service needed to be improved, and novelists who explored the dynamics of the great house with a sharpness that suggests they understood exactly what they were describing. But in the daily living of it, in the morning of 1882 or 1884 or 1886, the arrangement worked because it was the arrangement, and both Eleanor and Agnes occupied their places within it, with the practiced fluency of people for whom it had simply always been so. The difference, of course, is that Eleanor's place was warm and the fire was already burning when she woke, and Agnes's place required her to light the fire before anyone else was cold, in the dark in a house that was not hers. Now let us go a little further into the specifics of what the Victorian morning demanded of both women in terms of the physical environment they inhabited, because the house itself was a third presence in this morning, as important to understand as either Eleanor or Agnes, and its requirements shaped both their days in ways that are easy to overlook. The Victorian house in the 1880s was, by modern standards, both more beautiful and more demanding than anything most people in the developed world live with today. More beautiful in the sense that almost every surface was decorated, wallpapered walls with intricate patterns, cornices of plaster that had been designed and installed by craftsmen, floors of polished wood or tile or good carpet, curtains and upholstery in rich fabrics that required specialized care. The Victorian interior at its best in the 1880s had a density and richness of texture that modern minimalist design has largely moved away from, and there is something genuinely compelling about it. The way a well-appointed Victorian drawing room looks, the layers of pattern and material, the warm darkness of polished wood and deep colour, the feeling of a space that has accumulated its objects and its character over time, that beauty was enormously maintenance intensive. Every surface that was beautiful required care. The carpets had to be beaten regularly, taken up, moved outside or to the back corridor, and beaten with a flat paddle to remove the dust that accumulated in them, because Victorian houses with coal fires generated a constant fine deposit of soot and dust that settled on everything and had to be addressed multiple times a week. The windows had to be cleaned, inside and out, because the same coal soot that settled on carpets also settled on glass, and windows in a Victorian townhouse became grey and dull quickly if they were not attended to. The brass fittings, door handles, stair rods, fire tools, picture hooks, lamp brackets had to be polished with a paste that was applied and then rubbed off until they gleamed, because tarnished brass in a well-appointed household was a housekeeping failure. The silver, the tea service, the dinner service for company, the candlesticks, the various decorative pieces that accumulated in a prosperous Victorian household had to be cleaned with a specific silver polish applied with cloths and then buffed to a shine, and this cleaning had to happen regularly enough that the tarnish never had time to build up to a visible degree. All of this cleaning was done by the housemaids, under the direction of the housekeeper, on a schedule that was partly daily and partly weekly. Different rooms were deep cleaned on different days of the week, so that on any given day the household labour was distributed across the house rather than concentrated. Monday might be bedroom day, Tuesday the drawing room, Wednesday the dining room and entrance hall, and so on, with the daily cleaning of the kitchen and the morning tasks always providing a baseline of activity regardless of the weekly schedule. Eleanor understood this schedule in the abstract. She had approved or inherited it. She knew when certain tasks happened. She would notice immediately if something was amiss, but she was not herself involved in it in any physical sense. Her interaction with the cleaning of her house was supervisory. She checked, she noticed, she commented when necessary. She made adjustments to the schedule through the housekeeper. She did not scrub. She did not blacklead. She did not beat carpets or polish brass. She was the manager of all of this activity, and her skill lay in ensuring that it ran smoothly, that the right things were done at the right times, that the standard was maintained. The standard. This is a word that comes up repeatedly in Victorian domestic literature, in household management manuals, in the advice given to young housekeepers, in the descriptions that servants gave of the households they worked in. The standard was the invisible measure against which everything in the Victorian household was assessed, and it was both fixed and flexible. Fixed in the sense that certain things were simply always done to a certain level, and flexible in the sense that the standard adjusted to the household's social position and aspirations. A household of Eleanor's standing had a higher standard than the household she came from, probably, or the household she might have been in if she had married differently, and the maintenance of that standard was both a daily practical achievement and an ongoing social statement about who the Hartleys were and what they were able to afford and do. The coal fire and its management was one of the central maintenance tasks of the Victorian domestic day, and I keep returning to it because it seems to me one of the most telling illustrations of the difference between the Victorian domestic world and our own. The coal fire was the only source of heat in every room. A house like Eleanor's might have 5 or 6 fireplaces in regular use in the winter. The drawing room, the dining room, the study, the main bedroom, perhaps a second bedroom if there were guests, perhaps the morning room. Each one required its own supply of coal, its own laying and lighting, its own cleaning of ash. Each one was a small ongoing project of maintenance and attention. The coal was delivered periodically, great sacks of it carried through the house by the coalman and tipped into the coal cellar, and it was then moved around the house in coal scuttles as needed, a physical task of some weight and effort that was done by the housemaids and the kitchen maid in the mornings, and as needed throughout the day. The smell of coal and of coal smoke was simply the smell of Victorian indoor life. It was so constant and so universal that people did not remark on it, the way a modern person does not remark on the absence of coal smoke because it has simply never been there. The curtains absorbed it, the wallpaper absorbed it, hair absorbed it. The underside of furniture surfaces exposed to air grew a fine dark deposit over time, visible when you looked under a table or ran a cloth along the top of a picture frame. The periodic heavy cleaning that went into the management of a Victorian house, the annual spring cleaning, which really was an annual event and really did involve the near total emptying and cleaning of rooms, the washing of curtains, the repainting of ceilings, was partly a response to this ongoing depositing of combustion products on every surface. For Eleanor, the coal fire was warmth and comfort and the visual pleasure of a properly burning grate. For the housemaid who laid it every morning on her knees in the early dark, it was a physical task that left her hands rough and her knees bruised and her apron black, performed before the household was awake so that when the household woke, the warmth would simply be there. Now let us talk about water, because the management of water in a Victorian house was another area where the contrast between the front of house experience and the back of house labour was particularly sharp. Indoor plumbing in London in the 1880s was present in some houses and absent in others, and its presence or absence shaped the entire practical reality of the household's daily functioning. Where it existed, it typically meant cold running water to a kitchen sink, and possibly to a bathroom if the house had been modernised to include one. Hot running water was less common, and the production of hot water for any purpose, cooking, washing, bathing, the morning can, still required the kitchen range, and still required the physical labour of carrying that water from wherever it was produced to wherever it was needed. The bathing of a Victorian woman who did not have a bathroom with a connected tub, and many houses did not, was a production that required significant advance planning and servant labour. The portable tin bath, oval and flat-bottomed, was the standard domestic bathing implement in houses without fixed plumbing, and it was filled by carrying can after can of hot water up the back stairs from the kitchen, poured in, tested for temperature, adjusted, and then waited for. The whole process could require 20 or 30 gallons of water and half an hour of carrying, and after the bath was done, the water had to be bailed out or drained, and the bath wiped down and removed, and all of that also required labour. Eleanor bathed perhaps twice a week, or 3 times in summer when the heat made more frequent washing practical. The preparation for each bath was coordinated between herself and Agnes, with Agnes ensuring the water was carried and the room was warm and the towels and bathing equipment were ready, and with whatever lower servant was responsible for the water carrying doing the physical work of actually getting the water there. The result, for Eleanor, was a warm bath in a warm room with good soap and good towels, and nothing about the process was visible to her except the end result. This, again, is the fundamental structure of her morning, the invisible labour that produces the visible comfort. There is a particular kind of historical intimacy available to us when we look at the small material objects of this world, the soap and the hairpins and the corset and the coal scuttle, because these objects existed at the intersection of the two worlds we have been moving between all morning. They were used by Eleanor and maintained by Agnes. They were purchased according to Eleanor's preferences and carried according to Agnes's physical ability. They embodied the relationship between the two women without either of them explicitly representing it, the way a well-worn floor embodies the movement of everyone who has walked on it, without representing any particular step. The hairpins in the china dish on Eleanor's dressing table were bought, most likely, from the haberdashery department of a good draper on a shopping trip that Eleanor or Agnes made in the course of regular household provisioning. They cost a few pennies for a card of them. They were one of the smallest items in the household budget and also one of the most continuously used. Without them, the elaborate architecture of Eleanor's hair was impossible. With them, Agnes could build a structure that would hold for an entire day. The pins were functional. The pins were also, in some small way, a tool of the morning's performance, one of the instruments by which Eleanor's public presentation was created and maintained. The pin cushion that Agnes used, studded with the pins she was currently working with, placed on the dressing table within easy reach during the dressing process, was probably a decorative object because everything in a well-appointed Victorian dressing table arrangement was both functional and decorative, beaded or embroidered, probably in a design that reflected the fashion of its making, probably a gift from someone or sewn by someone in the household. It sat among the glass bottles and the brush and the hair receiver as part of the assembled domestic beauty of the space. Eleanor did not make the pincushion. She probably did not clean it or choose it or consider it particularly as an object. It was simply there, as everything was simply there, produced by the unseen labour that maintained the visible world. I want to talk about something that the history books on Victorian domestic life touch on but rarely dwell on: the emotional labour of the Victorian lady's maid relationship. Agnes knew things about Eleanor that very few other people knew. She knew that Eleanor's back ached sometimes after a long day in her corset, because she had seen Eleanor sit down heavily on the bedroom chair and exhale in a specific way that meant it had been a hard day. She knew that Eleanor had cried after one particular dinner party 6 months ago, alone in her bedroom after the guests left, though she would never speak of that to anyone. She knew the state of Eleanor's health in the intimate, specific way that comes from daily contact with a person's physical reality. She would know immediately if Eleanor was unwell, would recognize the specific pallor of a bad day, or the particular careful movements of a woman managing pain. And she was required to hold all of this knowledge with perfect discretion. Not just the formal discretion of keeping household secrets, though that was part of it. The deeper discretion of never acknowledging that she knew, never showing in her face or her manner that she understood something of the interior life of the woman she dressed every morning. The performance that Agnes gave was one of professional neutrality, present, skilled, attentive, available, and also in some important sense simply not there, in the sense of not having an independent perspective on what she witnessed. This performance had its costs. What Agnes actually felt about Eleanor, whether she liked her, whether she found her kind or difficult, or somewhere in the vast middle ground that most employer-servant relationships probably occupied, was not something that the historical record tells us, because the historical record was not interested in preserving it. What we know about Agnes as a type, if not as a specific individual, is that she was expected to manage her own emotional responses in exactly the way that made her most useful to the household, which meant that her personal feelings about her work and her employer were to be contained, processed privately, never expressed in ways that might create discomfort or complication. The morning, in this sense, was not just a production of domestic labour. It was a production of a specific kind of emotional management. Agnes maintained the warmth and the competence and the reliable professional presence that Eleanor's morning required, and Eleanor maintained the gracious, moderately engaged, appropriately grateful manner that made her a good employer in the vocabulary of her era, and between them they produced a morning that worked, that was warm and well managed and properly arranged, and that gave neither of them, at least not visibly, anything to be unhappy about. Whether either of them found this arrangement satisfying in some deeper sense is a question that the morning itself did not ask. Now let us go back to the clock and follow the morning through its later stages, because we have reached the hours, 10, 11, approaching noon, when Eleanor's household management activities were winding down and the social afternoon was beginning to approach, and this transition had its own rituals and preparations. The question of what Eleanor wore in the afternoon, specifically whether she changed from her morning dress to an afternoon dress, and what the afternoon dress looked like, was not a trivial question. In the social world of the 1880s upper classes, the appropriate dress for each part of the day was a code, and moving through the day in the wrong category of dress was a social misstep. Morning dress was for morning, afternoon dress for afternoon calls and receiving, dinner dress for the evening meal at home, evening dress for dinners with company and for any social occasions. The distinctions between these categories were real and visible. Different fabrics, different degrees of ornamentation, different requirements of cut and construction, and a woman who appeared in morning dress at an afternoon call was making a statement, whether she intended to or not. Agnes understood this code as well as Eleanor did, probably better in terms of the technical details, and the management of Eleanor's wardrobe across the day was one of the primary practical exercises of her position. The wardrobe itself, a large fitted piece of furniture with hanging space for the long dresses, shelves for folded items and drawers for smaller things, was Agnes's domain to maintain. She knew every garment in it, its condition, its last wearing, what cleaning or repair it might need, when it was last sent to the dressmaker, whether the colour was still in fashion or beginning to look dated. She maintained a mental inventory of the wardrobe that was probably more accurate than any written record, because the knowledge was built into her working relationship with the objects, the way a musician knows their instrument. The afternoon dress for a winter day in 1883 might be made of a dark silk or a woolen silk mixture, something with more sheen and weight than the morning wool, something that caught the light in the way that afternoon visits required, because calling and receiving was a visual activity as much as a social one, and one appeared for it in dress that acknowledged the audience. The construction followed the same fundamental lines as the morning dress: fitted bodice, gauze skirt with bustle, elaborate back detail, but the fabric and the trimming would be more pronounced, perhaps jet beading at the collar, perhaps a more elaborate sleeve treatment, perhaps the skirt had a train rather than the swept-up back of the walking version. Agnes lays this out in the late morning, checks it for any small issues, a loose button, a thread needing trimming, a piece of fringe out of place, and attends to them while Eleanor finishes her household correspondence, or receives the cook for the final menu discussion. When Eleanor signals that she is ready to change, the process happens again. The morning dress unfastened, put carefully onto its hook to await Agnes's attention later. The afternoon dress put on, fastened, checked. The hair is probably adjusted slightly, perhaps a small comb or additional ornament added for afternoon wear, perhaps the fringe recrimped if it has fallen since this morning, and the gloves are now put on because she will be going out or receiving visitors, and gloves were not optional for that kind of social contact. We have been inside this morning for a long time. Let me draw back slightly and offer you a wider view of what this morning represents in the history of women's daily life. Eleanor Hartley's morning was, by the standards of her era and class, an extremely comfortable and privileged morning. She had resources that most women in 1880s England did not have: servants to manage her domestic life, money to maintain a wardrobe appropriate to her social position, a husband who provided those resources, a social position that made the kind of morning she had both possible and, in the vocabulary of her world, necessary. But it was also a constrained morning in ways that are worth recognizing. The constraints were different from Agnes's constraints. They were not the constraints of labour and poverty and the absence of time for oneself, but they were real. Eleanor's morning was organised almost entirely around the presentation of herself and the management of others. Her choices were numerous but not free. She chose between dresses, but only from the dresses that fashion and her social position permitted. She chose which calls to make, but within the system of social obligation that meant failure to make the right calls had real consequences. She managed her household, but the management was itself a performance, assessed constantly by the network of other women who understood exactly what a well-run household should look like. and who would notice any failures. She was not, in the modern sense, free in her mourning. She was executing a role, doing it skillfully and with genuine engagement and some real pleasure, but the role was largely given rather than chosen. The shape of her days had been established by a combination of her class, her sex, her social position, and the elaborate system of expectations that Victorian society had constructed around all three of those facts about her. She navigated within it with intelligence and grace, and the mourning she produced every day was a considerable achievement. But no one called it that. The Victorian domestic ideal was, in this regard, almost perfectly constructed to make invisible the work it required. The woman who managed a household successfully, who produced a mourning that felt natural and effortless and warm, who maintained the social calendar and the domestic standard and the appropriate appearance simultaneously, was being exactly what she was supposed to be. The effort required to be that was not acknowledged as effort because effort was not supposed to be visible. The achievement was that it seemed to require no achievement, and the servants who made the underlying reality of that illusion possible, Agnes with her hairpins and her mourning can, the housemaid with her coal scuttle and her black leading brush, the cook with her kitchen range and her morning's work, they produced the conditions for Eleanor's effortlessness, and the condition of their success was also their invisibility. This is the mourning, in all its warmth and beauty and careful arrangement, in all its labour and intimacy and complex hierarchy, in all the small precise details of hot water and pressed collars and 100-stroke brushing and the right shade of dress for the right hour of the day. This is the morning that a wealthy Victorian woman woke into in the 1880s, and the fire was already burning, and the room was already warm, and somewhere above her head, in a small room under the eaves, Agnes was pulling on her work dress in the dark at 5:30, so that it would be so. I want to walk back through this morning one more time, more slowly, staying in the smaller moments, because I think there is something worth noticing in the textures of it that can get lost in the overview. Think about the moment when Eleanor's eyes opened, not the dramatic wake-up of an alarm, which she did not have, not the groggy scramble for a phone, which did not exist, just the natural surfacing from sleep into a room that was already warm, already dim, already waiting. The curtains were thick enough to hold the morning light out for as long as she needed them to. The room was quiet in the particular way of a house where everyone who needed to be doing something was already doing it 2 floors below. She could lie there for a few minutes, probably did most mornings, in the specific luxury of warmth and quiet that the household's early rising had purchased for her, and feel the day approach at its own pace. When Agnes knocked, it was not a disruption, it was a continuation. The day had been proceeding at its domestic level for hours already, and Agnes's knock was simply the moment when Eleanor's personal part in that day began. The knock was soft because it needed to be soft, because the transition from sleep to waking should, for a woman of Eleanor's position, be gentle. There was no reason for it to be anything else. There was no reason for it to be anything else. That phrase keeps surfacing for me as I think about this morning. There was no reason for Eleanor's mourning to be uncomfortable, to be rushed, to be cold, to involve the carrying of her own coal scuttle or the heating of her own water. All the reasons those things did not happen to her resided in her social position, in the money that social position generated, in the labour of the people who worked in her household, in the entire structure of a society that had decided certain lives were supported by the labour of others, and certain others did the supporting. There was no reason intrinsic to Eleanor herself why her mourning should be warm. There was every structural reason. The warmth of her mourning was not a gift. It was an entitlement, in the original sense, something she was entitled to by virtue of who she was in the hierarchy she had been born into and married into. And the production of that warmth was someone else's obligation, by virtue of who they were in the same hierarchy. Neither of them probably thought about it in these terms very often. The structure was too consistent, too daily, too thoroughly the water of the world to be remarkable. But late at night, in the darkness of the small room at the top of the house, When Agnes lay down on her narrow bed with the soles of her feet aching from the back stairs and her shoulders sore from the coal scuttle and her hands rough from the morning's work, she might have known, in some wordless way, something about the shape of the morning that Eleanor did not know. She might have known the weight of the copper can. She might have known the temperature of the kitchen before the range was lit. She might have known what the house sounded like at 5:30 in the morning, when the city was still dark and the family above was still sleeping, and the day was still only a prospect, requiring everything that was about to be done to it. Eleanor knew the warm room. Agnes knew the cold stairs that had to be climbed to make it warm. Both of them were part of the same morning. Both of them were essential to it. Only one of them was the one it was arranged for, the sewing. Let me tell you about the sewing because it connects Agnes's morning to her afternoon and evening in a way that illuminates the continuous nature of the work. Agnes was a skilled needlewoman, and part of what this meant practically was that the maintenance of Eleanor's wardrobe never fully stopped. There was always something that needed attention: a loose button, a small tear at a seam, a fastening that had come loose, a trim that was beginning to fray. These small repairs were part of Agnes's daily work, managed in the hours when Eleanor didn't need her immediate attention, usually in the afternoon while Eleanor was out making calls or receiving visitors, or in the early evening before dinner preparations required her presence again. The repair work was done with the same quality of attention that the dressing was done with: precise, careful, using the right thread and the right needle for the fabric, done in a way that would not be visible when the garment was worn. This was a different kind of skill from the dressing skill, but related to it. Both required knowledge of fabric and construction, knowledge of how garments were supposed to look and feel, knowledge of the specific ways that Eleanor's dresses stressed at their various seams and closures, and what that meant for how they needed to be repaired. And sitting in her small room or in the space designated for upper servants' work in the afternoon, Agnes sewed. She held the fabric up to the light to check a repair. She threaded her needle with a thread that matched so precisely that the repair would disappear into the fabric. She worked with the efficient speed of long practice and the careful attention of someone who knew that the standard was being maintained every time she made a stitch. Nobody saw her do it. Nobody was supposed to see her do it. The garment would reappear in Eleanor's wardrobe repaired, and Eleanor might notice vaguely that the small problem she had mentioned to Agnes last week had been resolved, or she might not notice at all because it simply looked as it should, and she expected it to look as it should, and that expectation was itself the condition of Agnes's professional life. The sewing represents something about this world that I find genuinely worth sitting with. The way that skilled work done on behalf of another person can be entirely absorbed into the experience of that other person's comfort without any acknowledgement of the work at all. The repair that disappears into the fabric is a perfect metaphor for the whole of the Victorian domestic servant's labour, done so well that it cannot be seen, which was the whole point, and which was also the reason it could so easily not be credited. Now let us move toward the close of the morning, toward the hour when the household has reached its midday rhythm and the morning's production is complete. By 12 o'clock or so, the main rooms of Eleanor's house are clean, the fires are burning, the household correspondence has been written and sent, the menus for the day have been discussed and confirmed, the morning dress has been exchanged for the afternoon dress, and Eleanor is ready for whatever the day requires. If there are calls to make, she will make them. If there are visitors expected, she will receive them. If there is luncheon to attend to, the table will be set in the dining room in the correct way. The house looks, at this hour, exactly as it is supposed to look. The drawing room is tidy and comfortable, the cushions plumped, the fire burning, the flowers on the table, if there are flowers, and in a household of Eleanor's standard there usually were, fresh-cut flowers arranged in good vases. Another task on the list of morning preparations, adding their colour and scent to a room that smells of clean fabric and warm fire, and the particular combination of domestic materials that makes a well-kept house smell like itself. There is nothing in this room at noon that speaks of the 5:30 morning in the kitchen, or the coal scuttle on the back stairs, or the pressing iron and the cold room. and the small rough hands that carried the morning can. The evidence of all of that has been absorbed into the smooth surface of the day. The labour has become comfort. The effort has become ease. This is Eleanor's morning. This is the morning that a wealthy Victorian woman woke into in the 1880s, assembled by many hands, organised by a machinery of domestic service that ran before she was awake and after she was asleep, produced through the skilled, continuous, underpaid, under-acknowledged labour of women who are harder to find in the historical record, because the history, like the morning itself, was arranged to make them invisible. The fire was already burning because someone lit it. The water was already warm because someone carried it. The dress was already pressed because someone pressed it. And Eleanor woke into all of this as into something natural, something given, something that had always been so and would always be so, moving through her morning with the graceful confidence of a woman for whom the world arranged itself in advance. In some ways, the most extraordinary thing about this morning is not the luxury, it is the coordination, the sheer organisational complexity of producing a morning that felt simple, the timing of the coal delivery to match the housemaid's morning rounds, the scheduling of the morning can to arrive at precisely the right interval after Agnes knocked, the laying out of the dress in the correct order so that the dressing could proceed without pause or confusion. This coordination was the housekeeper's art and Agnes's art and the cook's art and the housemaid's art, all working in parallel and without explicit communication, because the routines were established and everyone knew their part, and the execution was what professionalism looked like in this world. It is the coordination that the historical record almost never describes directly, because the people doing the coordinating did not write memoirs, or if they did, those memoirs were not preserved, or if they were preserved, they were not collected into the libraries where historians worked. And so what we know about the Victorian morning from the upper-class side of the domestic boundary is rich and detailed, and what we know from the other side is fragmentary and partial and largely reconstructed from the records that other people kept on servants' behalf. The wage books, the references, the institutional records of training institutions and domestic registries, the occasional diary that someone thought worth keeping or someone else thought worth saving. But the coordination happened. Every morning it happened, in thousands of households across London and across England, producing warm rooms and hot water and pressed dresses and properly arranged hair, and the whole edifice of upper-class domestic comfort that the Victorian era took as its entitlement. It was one of the great continuous organisational achievements of the era, performed by women who were paid £12 to £15 a year and who were expected to be invisible. And on the other side of it, Eleanor Hartley woke up warm. That is where the morning ends and the afternoon begins, in that seamless soft transition from the managed morning to the social afternoon, from the private rituals of dress and hair and household management to the public performance of calling and receiving and navigating the elaborate social landscape of 1880s upper middle England. The dress has been changed, the gloves are on, the calling cards are in the small card case in Eleanor's bag, her name engraved on them, Mrs. John Hartley, printed on thick cream card in a font that is correct and appropriate without being ostentatious. She will leave them at doors where she calls and is not received, or hand one to the parlour maid who opens the door and shows her into the drawing room, and the leaving and receiving of these small rectangles of card is as governed by protocol as everything else in her world. Fold the corner for a personal call, leave it face up in the silver tray by the door. Not too many and not too few left at any given house. The whole system tracking the social obligations and connections of a world that communicated through physical paper. She goes out. The door closes behind her. The house continues. Agnes is already in the workroom with the morning dress across her lap, checking a seam that came slightly loose at the left shoulder. The housemaid is cleaning the brass on the front door. The cook is managing the kitchen for luncheon. The house works on, producing the conditions for the next return, the next morning can, the next pressed dress, the next carefully arranged fire. It is this continuity that I keep returning to. The way the morning was not an event but a process, not a single day but the daily repetition of a structure that went on, unchanged in its essentials, For as long as these households existed in this form, the specific dress changed with fashion. The specific servants changed as positions turned over. The specific details of the household budget and the social calendar and the neighborhood changed. But the structure, the coal scuttle on the back stairs, the morning can, the dressing in the correct order, the calling cards, the social afternoon, the servant's invisibility, Eleanor's warmth, the structure was the same, morning after morning, year after year, in the 1870s and the 1880s and into the 1890s as the era began to shift, slowly, toward the slightly looser world of the Edwardian period, and eventually toward the enormous disruption of the First World War, which would tear apart the domestic service industry in ways that no one in this carefully arranged morning could have anticipated. For now, though, in the particular morning we have been inhabiting, it is 1882 or 1883, and the structure is intact, and the fire is burning, and Agnes is sewing in the workroom, and Eleanor is in a carriage on her way to make her afternoon calls, and the morning has been, by every measure available to her world, a good one, warm, well managed, perfectly arranged, as it was always supposed to be, as someone had always made it so. I want to close with something small. One specific detail that I have been carrying throughout this whole morning and that I keep finding my way back to because it seems to me to contain something essential about the world we have been visiting. The morning can, the copper or brass container, about the size of a large teapot, with a long narrow spout and a well-fitted lid to keep the heat in during the journey from kitchen to bedroom. Agnes would have carried it carefully, 2 flights of stairs on the back staircase, keeping it level so the water didn't slosh, feeling the heat of it through the handle that was designed to be held without burning. She would have set it on the washstand marble, lifted the lid, poured the water into the basin, a thin, precise stream, controlled, and tested the temperature with the back of her hand before she was satisfied that it was right. 1 gallon of hot water, perhaps 1.5, enough for a proper wash, carried up 2 flights of stairs by a young woman who had already been working for 2 hours, so that Eleanor could wash her face in warm water. That is the Victorian morning in one image. That is what luxury meant and what it cost and who paid it and who received it. Contained in a single small object moving up a back staircase in the early morning of 1883. The can is on the washstand, the water is steaming, the day is about to begin, and 2 floors below, Agnes has already gone back to the kitchen for the next thing. Rest now. The morning has been long, and the afternoon awaits, but for this moment you can just be still in the warmth of it, in the particular, complex, achingly human warmth of a Victorian morning that asked so much of some people and gave so much to others, and that somehow produced, out of all that labour and all that hierarchy and all that careful invisible management, something that was genuinely beautiful. The fire crackles. The curtains let in a thin line of grey London light. Agnes's footsteps on the back stairs have already faded to silence, and upstairs in the warm room Eleanor is waking up.